Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of World Bigfoot Radio. And this episode, we have somebody that's been on the show before. And rather than just talk about experiences that we've had, we're going to talk about a story, a really gripping Bigfoot story. And some of you have probably heard this story before. Before I bring on the guest, as a matter of fact, I'm going to give you guys the short version of the story. And I'm going to bring my guest on, and he's going to tell me what's wrong with this story. So now this story is set back in the middle of another century past, the 1800s, and specifically it's credited to have happened in 1855 on the eastern side of Oklahoma to a gentleman named Captain Joshua LaFlore, who is supposedly a cavalry officer, and he had teamed up with a band of the local Choctaw Indians, specifically with one family called the Tubbies, Tubbee, were having problems with all of their farms being raided and their produce being made off with, and apparently lots of large quantities of corn, squash, beans, and local children were being taken. And so this not being a situation that they were willing to put up with, they got the aid of this cavalry officer, and with a band of 30 men, including the Tubbies, they went into what would later become the Curtin County Wilderness area to find out what was going on. Now, according to the story, the locals already knew it was Bigfoot that were doing this. There was a band of local Bigfoot that were doing all this raiding. So they apparently spent quite a while on the trail, and after 4:30 in the afternoon, Captain Josh spotted their quarry at, according to the story, about 500 yards with the aid of a ship's eyepiece, whereupon they charged on horseback. Now, the 30 or so that charged on horseback, the horses, when they got close, became unruly because of the smell of the Bigfoots and whatnot, and started to panic and wouldn't go forward anymore. But Captain LaFleur's horse and the horses of 7 of the others, of the Tubby boys, were apparently better steeds, and they managed to maintain control of them. And so they left the other guys behind as their horses raced forward. Now, the captain supposedly was way out in front of all of them. And when he got within range, he drew his pistol and cavalry saber. So, wow, that's quite a feat. You're on a charging horse, and you got both hands full. And then the nearest Bigfoot, when he came up on him, swatted the captain's horse and killed it dead with one swat. Now, somehow managing to not do a face plant and somehow rolling with both of his hands full, he comes to his feet, empties his pistol into the monster's chest, firing every shot. Then he manages to amazingly strike this strangely immobile and slow Bigfoot several times with his saber, opening up huge blood-spilling, gaping wounds in it. All while this is happening, nobody's really doing anything else except for finally they realize something's going on, apparently, and they all pull their rifles out, and the 7 remaining guys take shots at the 3 Bigfoot, 6 of them firing their rounds into the 2 that were killing the captain. One of them had gotten around behind the captain after he did all this damage to the one in front of him and apparently tore the captain's head off. And it was at this point that they finally fired on him, and they killed those 2 Bigfoot, and the 7th guy put 1 round through the remaining 3rd Bigfoot's head, whereupon they checked the scene of all this carnage, and they found out that there was these 19 missing children partially eaten and left in a huge pile. And so they buried all the children, and they put the Bigfoot bodies into a mound and burned them up. And so now it's time to bring on our guest. Hey, what's wrong with this story?
It was written by a gentleman from Oklahoma named Cliff Sewell, but he also goes by the name Tuklo Nashoba. And he happens to be Choctaw. I don't know if he's full-blooded, but he claims lineage to Choctaw. And Cliff also writes children's stories and books. I've never heard it said that this story was true or not, but it's such a fantastic story that it's taken on a life all on its own. And it is a fictional account, and a lot of people are just under the misperception that this is a true story. It's really not a true story.
Oh, Dude, this is like one of the coolest Bigfoot stories ever. It's juicy and violent, and Bigfoot's a terrible monster, and there's a heroic cavalry captain that for some reason has to save the Indians like they couldn't do it themselves. You're telling me that this isn't true? Is there any grain of truth to this story?
Well, that's the deal, brother. There is a grain of truth to it, but it did not involve the Choctaw Nation, and it also did not involve firearms. There is a story told to me by a good friend of mine who is Kiowa when I stayed out there at Dan and Vicky's in southwest Oklahoma, that there is a particular location where the Kiowa, which one of the translations for the word means the people went to war with Bigfoot, and they actually found their lair on an outcropping of rock out there somewhere, kind of a hill, and on top of the hill is some rocks and things like this. And this is supposedly where the Kiowa Nation went to war with a tribe of Bigfoot and eliminated them. You got to also understand the Kiowa did not have their own written language from this era and time, but they would pass the stories down to each generation as they come up. And so through the passing of time and these stories is where this gentleman told me of the Kiowa people going to war with Bigfoot.
So was there, before we go into the Kiowa story, was there any, did you find any actual evidence for the Choctaw story that the other
Well,
version
listen to the story itself. It talks about this Choctaw chief or leader whose horse advanced further than the others.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at the date.
Like half Choctaw and half French. So,
well, yeah. I'm looking at the date 1855, and yet he supposedly popped off 6 rounds into the chest of this thing before he applied the saber. Mm-hmm. And I know that they was black powder pistols back then, but normally up until the the Mexican War, before the War of Northern Aggression, most pistols were single-shot flintlock-type pistols in 1855. I'm not saying that, it's not possible, but then also in the story...
He's in the cavalry, he's in the military, they got the top-of-the-line new stuff.
Well, you talk of the military, which I do understand that the Choctaw also have their own police force or militia-type group, and they would patrol together and come together whenever they needed to deal with any trouble-like situations, especially trouble that needed larger numbers.
Right.
And I just, I think that the author, being Choctaw, may have heard a version of the Kiowa story, because out there in that part of southwestern and south central Oklahoma, various tribes do live together out there, not on top of each other, but they hear each other's culture, their history, and their folklore, and I'm thinking that's where the concept for the story come from. I believe he just turned the First Nation people, which were the Kiowas tribe, into a Choctaw tribe, of which, as far as I know, he's a member of, which is the Choctaw Nation. Yeah.
I know that you also know members of the Choctaw tribe, and have any of them come forward and said that this is one of their traditional stories?
I've never heard any Choctaw speak of this as being a true story. Actually, I'm thinking what it is more than anything is, it's kind of like when the legend precedes the truth, keep repeating the legend. And, like I know, me and you have discussed this several times in the past. this story is exciting. It's got blood, it's got guts, it's got excitement, it's got horses, it's got monsters, and they're going to battle over children being kidnapped or taken. And I mean, it would make a great movie. Not Oscar worthy, but maybe, you know, a B class where instant to a video or something or cable. But I just, you know,
a big budget B movie, you know,
right.
At least like on the scale of Abominable or something. It would
right. The Kiowa story, the one I've been told though, is very interesting in and of itself. And
well, let's hear the Kiowa version now, because this is an oral legend of theirs that you have been able to actually verify that they've been passed.
Right.
And it's quite a bit different, and it's not just one skirmish, so go ahead.
Right. Of course, the Kiowa were a very nomadic type tribe, and they would move around. This was mainly to keep fresh grass or forage for the horses. And, you know, anytime you'd have your typical camp-like setting after any certain length of time from staying in one location, you know, due to sanitary purposes like, you know, bathroom usage and things like this, you had to occasionally, you know, move your whole encampment and move elsewhere. That's what I mean by them being nomadic. And every time they would move their camp, they would also have what they would call a certain lodge set aside for women who would reach sexual maturity and go through their monthly menstrual cycle. When a woman was in the early stages of going through her monthly, if a warrior touched her, looked upon her, anything like that, it was known within the tribe that this took away his warrior inner spirit, that she was unclean, and that any warrior that, even if they accidentally touched her, I'm talking about their mother or their sister or whatever, especially their wife, when these women would go into this, it was usually, 7 to 10 day period, they would all have to go to this hut or lodge on the outer fringes of the encampment. Well, the ones who would take care of these women, since it could not be men, for sure, they would get these older ladies who had lost their husbands in battle, or they didn't have no family or whatever. They would be the keepers of this lodge, and it would constantly be young maidens or women going through their monthlies that would come in and out of that lodge during this time that they was considered unclean. Well, that's why I mentioned what I did about the odor earlier of encampments. It got to the point after a while, the odor was so prevalent, a lot of times they was assuming this was what was attracting the neighboring or the Bigfoot that were in the general vicinity. And these things would break into the back of the lodge and snatch up a young maiden or two on occasions. Well, when this would occur, since no warriors were involved in, the perimeter or the general immediate vicinity of where this lodge was located at, this thing would be successful in snatching one of these maidens and running off into the wilderness with them and then never see them again. It got to such an extreme that the elders had to come together with various other sects or tribes of the Kiowa Nation, and they decided that they had to go to war or to exterminate these creatures that were doing this. And getting back to the LaFlore story, this was way before the Kiowa Nation had any firearms at all. Basically, what they were using were bow and arrow, spear, lance, maybe a tomahawk, and knives. But they went to war. They had various scouts go out and locate the sign, and they had been successful in trailing it back to this certain hill. And supposedly the hill is still out there in Oklahoma, but I even asked the person that was telling me the story, is it near where we was at? Which he said, no, it's north of here, and I was in southwest Oklahoma at the time. But he never would reveal where this actual location where the cow was supposedly exterminated a whole family unit of Bigfoot.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like they not only went after the ones that they knew were responsible for what at the moment was teeing them off, but they sort of went wider and went, well, we're just going to get all of them out of our area.
Well, you know, let's look at Bigfoot as how we know him anyway. They may have assumed it was one, may even be two, but then when they get to where they're at and they're confronted with the actual numbers that are there, I can just imagine, you know, not only the sheer terror, just looking on something like this. I mean, even back in those days, I don't think that Bigfoot was easy to see or anything like he is today. I mean, this just is something that innately has been driven in its life as far back as I've ever heard of, you know. There may have been one time way back, probably way further back, where First Nation people and Bigfoot got along together. But I honestly believe, even before the Europeans come to this continent, I think that the First Nation people and Bigfoot, most of the tribes anyway, were at an uneasy peace with each other. Not so much at war, but for some reason, I think Bigfoot decided a long time ago not to trust people of a human-type nature long before the Europeans even got here. I just get that perception at times.
Yeah, but yet him and Neanderthals still like to abduct and defile our women. Go figure.
Well, you know, I read something interestingly enough just this week on something that was pertaining to that, and they said, you know, if human DNA is in the blood, and I really believe it is, that means that at some stage in time there was interbreeding here, whether it was willingly or unwillingly. But maybe that could be just enough extent to keep Bigfoot interested enough or wary of us at times more so than others.
Yeah.
You know, human nature tends to draw people to each other. And I wonder at times, I mean, everything we know about Bigfoot, it is smart enough to recognize not to trust man. And honestly, do you blame him?
No.
What I think happened to this story, Duke, I just think if the legend is more exciting than the actual truth, print the legend, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think if they would have had more details on the actual legend and this one would have gotten around first, this one would have been the story. Because it wasn't just like one fight. I mean, they chased all of them out of their territory, you know. And isn't that sort of like plains, and they're semi-nomadic down there by virtue of its plains for the most part, which means they could have had a big area that they had to chase them out of.
Right. I actually heard the Kiowa version before Tucklow wrote, well, maybe not wrote it, but posted it, or however he got the word out about the story originally. And to be honest about it, I've never heard anybody declare that Cliff or Tucklow declared this as a true story. I just think a lot of times he allowed it to live a life of its own, you know.
Right, like it was such a good story. Why kill it by telling everybody that it's not real?
Right, right. And, you know, as I said to you, me and you talked about this a bunch of times, and you know it. There's all, you know, the Bigfoot community runs in cycles anyway. And I guarantee you within 2 years, or maybe even sooner, somebody else read this story and, hey, have y'all seen this, man? If this is real, this is one of the most exciting stories I ever heard come out of, you know, the Bigfoot world. There was, back in the day when I first got on the internet with this, it was in the 2000s, you could go and, I think it was called the Okefenokee UFO page or something. And they have a story in there now that went way back to the early 1800s in the Okefenokee swamp, where about 8 or 9, envision this, Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett type outdoorsman went after tall monsters in the Okefenokee swamp. And supposedly they came upon these monsters, and it ended up killing something like all but 2 or 3 of the party survived. Several of the people had their heads ripped off during the actual physical confrontation. Now, you got to envision this in the early 1800s. They was using either Kentucky long rifles or, in other words, they had one shot. They had to stop, stuff a darn...
They had pirate pistols and single-shot muzzle-loading smoothbore rifles.
Now, see, that could be a hell of a story about Bigfoot, too, that would draw a lot of attention, you know, if somebody was to come up with something out of that. And,
that's a longer story, too. That actually is supposed to be spread out over like 2 weeks. There was initially a kid and one of his friends that found this line of tracks. Scared the hell out of them. They went back and told the townspeople, and the toughest guys muscled up and we'll go monster hunting. And most of them didn't come back, but they did kill the monster.
Right. And that happened in Florida or Georgia. You know, that's where the
I know the area. It was northern Florida. It was right on the border of Florida and Georgia. It was right in that area.
And if you think of it that way, and then you listen to the LaFlore account, which, you know, it's fictional, and actually, the Okefenokee story was more basis in truth in the time era for what it was, you know. So, but that LaFlore story, it has plenty of clues in it if you sit there and separate it out, and there's just no way a lot of that can be possible. You know, a lot of the equipment and a lot of the firearms and things like that wasn't around about that time. And I know there was black powder pistols because Texas Rangers used them, you know, just right after the Alamo and everything, but they were few and far and in between, and I just don't see that militia unit having any multiple firearms, and also knowing that the story I had heard came from the Kiowa tribe. I see it as fiction. I don't see it any other way.
Well, at the time that the Kiowa would have been having a conflict with these guys, there wouldn't have been any white men or any, you know, any boomsticks of any kind out there for them to be using.
That's true. That's true. What it was, and it always just, you know, blew me away because it confirmed what I've already was told by other First Nation people, that these things do and have a history of kidnapping women. And that's to produce offspring with. And I've heard of this actually happen. So, you know, the smell is there, say, in this hut. Any length of time that you're there, the smell's going to predominate, and that was the problem that the Kiowa tribe was having at that point in time. What I always, you know, I'm always sick in the head anyway. I always envision the council coming together and deciding, look, man, we got to do something about this. Something's breaking in our medicine hut over here, and they're running off with all the women. So we're going to have to place a warrior to watch the women, but you can't watch a woman because if you look upon a woman when she's in that condition, you'll lose your warrior status within the tribe. Yeah, so could you just envision being this warrior, damned if you do, damned if you don't? Are you with me?
Either they got to have a blind warrior or one with a blindfold on. And make sure he stands far enough away from the
he's got to be connected enough to see these big hairy monster that's stealing all the women too. So I mean.
Well, that's it. They're put in an impossible position. They've either got to completely change the way that they do things, or they've got to get rid of the problem, which is Bigfoot.
Right, and that's what they decided to do. And it was an amazing story when it was told to me by this Kiowa, and all the time he was telling the story in and of itself, I could envision everything that was going on. And here we go back to the Neshoba story, the LaFlore County story about Choctaw tribe. It's basically the same way, only I know the author. I know he's a fictional author. I know he's interested in Bigfoot, and I've never heard him say that it was based on true facts. The only truth to it I know of, it's so similar to the story coming from the Kiowa Nation that's the only similarities I can actually see.
Mm-hmm. So now, did you get the details from the Kiowa story? Did they just go after this one group of Bigfoot, or did they just say, well, that's
From everything I'm understanding, they just annihilated one family unit because it all happened on this certain hill or plateau out there. And when he said it's north of here, that indicated to me that it was somewhere north of the I-40 corridor, west of Oklahoma City, somewhere out that way. That's the general impression I'm getting anyway.
Did they have any information on, you would assume if they were stealing women for breeding purposes that there would be women there? Did they get any of their women back?
I'd heard, occasionally one of these females would escape, and I think that even one of them escaped who was pregnant, and she even had a stillborn childbirth with it, half monster or however, to her it's probably her child. It's all a frame of mind. A lot of times, when things like this occur, it takes a very strong female to survive anything like this mentally, I can just imagine.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard even more recent stories, not within the last 50, 60 years, but back in the day, more so in the 50s and the 60s out there in Oklahoma, and it probably occurred a lot more before then. Also, a lot of these First Nation women would be abducted by these things, and then if they survived or escaped, they was placed in the mental institutions. And even if they was as sane as day is light, I'm thinking a lot of times if they was trying to tell somebody what actually happened to them, they was just declared mentally incapable, so they was admitted to all these mental institutions. And it used to happen quite often from everything. It happened so much, Duke, that I was understood to believe that that's why a lot of the First Nation tribes out there don't even want to even discuss this with anybody.
Right. When you talk about Bigfoot, you end up talking about, Bigfoot used to steal our women and molest them and enslave them or whatever.
Well, even us discussing it right now, a lot of people out there snicker about it. But I don't, I've heard of these stories from various First Nation people all over the North American continent. Historically, it's in the a lot of accounts. I think J.W. Burns, wasn't that the guy who wrote all those accounts up there nearabouts where you're at now, Duke?
Yep.
That missionary guy, I mean, he told of a couple of incidences where females who disappeared were abducted and were able to escape, and that one of the females had a stillborn birth of something that, they declared wasn't natural.
Yeah. Story of Seraphine Long is along those lines, too, where a younger Bigfoot kidnapped her and brought her to his cave with his family, old Bigfoot, and after about a year, she was getting really sick and convinced him basically, bring me back to my tribe or I'm going to die.
Right.
And, apparently on the way there, he had, covered her eyes with, pine sap or something. He had, glued her eyes shut so she couldn't see where she was going, and he did the same thing on the way back. But he brought her back and dropped her off again. And her and were the other kidnapped guys. Of course, you had Muchele Harry and Albert Osman that both also claimed that up at the Toba Inlet they were kidnapped by families of Bigfoot. So even the guys got kidnapped occasionally, probably just because they were interesting. But there's a lot of this with the women getting kidnapped and from all over North America. Another thing I could chime in here is that it seems like the further west you go, the more there wasn't as much conflict about it. They seem to have better communication with the Bigfoot and get along with them better. And there's a couple tribes that I know of here in the Pac West area that used to have the custom that if a woman wanted to go marry a Bigfoot or something, essentially, that was okay. So it wasn't like they were stealing the women from over there. Apparently they had some kind of an arrangement with them.
Well, what's getting overlooked in all of this, everybody says, what in the hell is this thing? Well, if it can mate with a human and produce an offspring, what in the hell is it, Duke?
Well, it's got to be something really genetically close to us in order to be able to do that. But, again, is it actually producing an offspring? Or is it, they're mating with horses, too. They're not producing
but I ain't never heard of a horse having a child look like a Bigfoot, across the boy, that would be a
Bigfoot
interesting creature right there.
Thank God that ain't going to work. But my point is just because it's not necessarily that they're thinking that they want to produce offspring. It could be just like, oh, that's pretty close to what a female Bigfoot looks like. I'll just steal that, use it for a sex toy.
I'm thinking what it is the odor, man. I'm thinking it's the sexual smell. I mean, I really do. I think it's the catalyst that just really cranks them up and gets their attention. I do know this. You can read all these encounters and sightings and things that's happened throughout the years, and most of the reports of the ones peeking in bedroom windows are, I'd say 85% of them, they're looking in bedroom windows of little girls from the age of 11 to 13 years of age. I mean, I've done that demographic, which, I don't know if somebody's ever done it or not, but that stuck out to me plain as day when you start reading other accounts where these things are looking in bedroom windows. Most of the bedroom windows are in windows of rooms where young ladies who are just having their probably first menstrual cycles are the ones that these things are looking in the windows of.
Yeah, and that matches the story from Indiana that we got where the whole damn small town went to war with them because one of them broke in the living room window trying to grab the teenage daughter. And unfortunately for it, knocked both her and her brother off the couch. Didn't get to grab either one.
Well, even the story from Anobi, the siege at Anobi, that was part of the, the things that were leading up to the actual shooting. This thing was looking in the younger girl's bedroom window.
Yeah, that's some creepy stuff. I mean, just especially for parents, now you got to worry about not just the teenage boys, but Bigfoot trying to grab your teenage girl too.
Well, a lot of people, they don't think about it. They say, well, how in the hell they can sense that? Well, think about it. Outdoors, if you have indoor plumbing, you don't have your average sewage system. You've got what you call the septic tank. Every septic tank has to have an outward flow of water, even if it's way down the hill. And this outward flow of water every time you flush the toilet is in the septic tank, and the scent or the odor will just naturally flow out of the pipe onto the ground. That's how it's so easy for these things to smell when a woman comes into season.
And even if you don't have that, you've got feminine hygiene products in the trash can.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And the trash can goes out to either be picked up, or if you burn your own garbage or whatever, I mean, the clues are all there. People just need to recognize them for what they are.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I have heard a lot of accounts along these lines, too, and you wonder about some of these lone women hikers that disappear or something like this is what happens.
Well, that combined with an animal that's very opportunistic, it leaves yourself open for a lot of bad things to happen. These things watch us every day because we're their entertainment. They recognize when something new is factored into the equation. They recognize that what that new thing is not acknowledged by others of us. They're smart enough to figure out that this person is, as far as they can see while they're watching it, is by themselves, and then they wait for the given opportunity, and that compiled with just what you referred to, Duke, makes your statement absolutely correct. The odds increase exponentially that could be a possibility why that person's missing.
Oh, God. Yeah, it's just frightening. And the other thing is that, like I pointed out to a lot of people on different occasions on the show, that some people think Bigfoot can't tell what a gun is. For God's sakes, even grizzly bears and mountain lions can figure that one out. So if some little lady's walking through the woods and she hasn't got some obvious, pistol on her hip or a rifle on her shoulder, they know she doesn't have a gun. But even a bear knows that.
It's not so much it's what's the odds of it, I mean, I can see them goading each other on or looking at a potential prey or potential whatever they're thinking about at the time. And, determining all on their own, because, we always talk about how these things will test you at times by breaking a stick off to the side or a huff or do something walking in step with you, and once it recognizes that it can see it's physically, mentally screwing with the person's head that they're focused on, that makes them more brazen. Even if that person has a firearm, they can sense when people like that go into the early stages of panic.
Well, as far as that goes, from what we can tell, they've got a pretty damn acute sense of smell, and they may be able to even smell like the difference in your sweat when you've got more adrenaline in it.
There's no doubt about it. I've done seen it happen too many times. I've watched people that's gone with us, and we're put into a situation where we actually encounter one scene. I mean, the incident where a rowdy just panicked and he run between me and Matt Knapp that time down there at Lake of the Pines in Texas. That rascal was focused totally on Rowdy hauling ass. Then it become prey versus predator. I'm not saying that he was going to grab Rowdy and break him in two or drag him home for supper. I just think at times they get caught up in the act to the degree they can't help themselves. It's like, hey, let's play tag. That sucker's running like hell from me, so I'm going to go tag his ass,
Yeah. Well, sheer reflex action, that happens quite a bit with some of the big predators they talk about, like bears and mountain lions. That's why you don't run away from them, because even if they weren't thinking about attacking you, that'll trigger a chase response from them.
Well, when that thing was heading straight to me and Matt, even when it was coming towards us, I could tell it was still focused on Rowdy, who had run between us. You know?
See,
I
that's
mean,
what I'm
really.
saying.
It was light to the, and you know, if it hadn't been for the fact that Sam Armstrong had bought me a spotlight, you know, for picking him up in Memphis and taking him all the way out there to Texas, that was the only reason I had that darn spotlight in my hand. But I said, oh, hell, if I don't do something, this son of a bitch is going to knock me and Matt down because, I mean, we was fairly close together, and he was coming dead at us at a run, and I just threw that spotlight up and hit it on and hit him in the eyes. Well, when I did, it was like I'd hit him with a pole axe. I mean, he hit the ground immediately. He threw his dang right arm up across of his eyes, and it started screaming because what had happened, you know, his eyes were already fully extended, as open as they could for the ambient light, you know, in their version of night vision. And then I hit him square in the face at about 20 yards with that darn spotlight, and it just burned him pretty good, and he hit the ground like he was pole-axed. And, you know, that's when I told Matt to get over there and get in the truck, and Matt couldn't get in the truck because Rowdy done jumped in there and locked all the damn doors. And we was all standing there with a pissed-off booger rolling down on the ground, raising 10 times worth of hell because he couldn't see.
And as soon as he could see, you guys are going to be in a lot of trouble.
I was hoping he'd have that white spot. You know how you're always blinded by... I was hoping his eyes were burned enough that he'd stumble through the woods in the opposite direction instead of messing with us again.
Fingers crossed, hope for the best.
But then
well, as it turned out, you finally got out of there.
Matt finally cons him into unlocking the door. Matt jumps in the truck, and he puts his key in the ignition, and he forgot that when, you know, he goes to cranking up the truck, it's going to lock the doors again. Well, there's me and Sam still standing outside the truck. Matt done cranked the son of a bitch up, and I heard the locks when they locked. And I said, this son of a bitch is going to leave us. And I looked over there at Sam, and Sam still had his spotlight, but he also had, I think he had a 9mm in his hand. And that poor hand was shaking. He said, I got him, Bal. I got him. I said, well, I hope like hell you do, because Matt done locked us out. And then you could hear me and Sam we was hitting his dang, you know, it's one of them pull-ups handles. We'd pull that son of a bitch up and it wouldn't open. It was going floppity, 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 floppity. I mean, if there had been a film crew filming us that night, that'd been funny as hell. Everybody in the world done made, yeah.
Yeah, what happens when a Bigfoot comes charging at you in the dark?
Well, Matt realized that doors were locked, so he finally unlocked them, and we jumped in and hauled ass. We didn't go far, though. We just evaded that general location to let the whole thing settle down a little bit, because we called in Dan and Vicky and them. They was farther down the road, and we told them to come back there, and we'd all meet up right at that same spot. And we had some good activity there the rest of the night. I don't think it was the one we scorched his eyes, though. He wasn't no happy camper about it. That's for damn sure.
Yeah, who knows what that would do to their eyes, actually. You might not have been able to see very well for a while.
Well, you know, it may have been the thing that saved us, but he was after Rowdy. But to get to Rowdy, he had to run right between me and Matt. And me and Matt pretty big old boys, and that wouldn't have happened because he'd have hit us like two pinatas, and I wasn't about letting that go down, you know, especially holding a spotlight in my hand.
Oh, God. Well, you're lucky you managed to have that spotlight and blinded.
Oh, okay, I got you. I got you, my man. It saves a lot of people. If a booger cannot gradually adapt to something, if it's thrown onto him, especially a bright light or something like that spontaneously, that irritates them a little bit, and they go on about their business.
Well,
that's why I've always told people to use motion sensor lights, you know, in their backyards and things like that.
Yeah. No, that's one of the things that the Kiowa didn't have is spotlights or anything like that.
Nope.
You know, and there's just no options for them. They
None
couldn't put
at
up
all.
spotlights, and they didn't have game cams and electric fences or minefields or.
None of that. And you know, in the story in and of itself, I've thought about it and I've envisioned it a million times after I was told it, even before the LaFlore story came out. And it's a hell of a story. It's a hell of a story.
Yeah, that's really damn scary. Did they give any kind of a general or even better specific number of how many Bigfoot were actually involved?
They said it was a tribe. Now, I don't know what constitutes a tribe.
I would guess that's probably more than a family unit, though.
Well, see, that's another thing about it. They used the tribe as a description of them being together on that hill. And that just shows me that even today, these things still form tribes. And they're more closely associated to the First Nation people. That's why I've always said everybody, before they go into a location, needs to study the local wildlife and things like that, the history, and especially the local tribes that used to live and maintain life in those areas, because it does help tremendously to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and you can bet your bottom dollar that whatever tribe is in that area knows a lot more about the Bigfoot in that area than people outside of it do.
They do, especially the elders, because they still do, tribes do still pass down their traditions, but they don't do it freely. They're having a lot of problems with today's youth, not catering to the culture and the ways, and usually if they survive a hard upbringing, you know, by rebelling against their own people, and they survive life's test and come to the realization that, you know, it is smart to come back within the culture of the people, that's when a lot of people then are told the actual stories and the things that are still being passed down today. But the numbers of these type people who you can willingly pass this information down is getting smaller and smaller every year. And it's a shame that it's this way.
The truism throughout time is that in order to be old and wise, you first have to be young and foolish.
Yes,
when you're young and foolish, you're not going to learn it.
Survive that. And, you know, sadly to say, within the First Nation people, especially, you know, anybody that gets hooked on drugs or alcohol, their survival rate is not high numbers at all.
Oh, I know, it's horrifying.
It is.
And then the other thing is the general, you know, the general move away from their own culture, you know, and this sort of, what the white man was trying to indoctrinate them toward for the last 100 years, to abandon your culture and jump on the white man's culture. And all of a sudden it's like, now that we're not really even trying anymore, they are doing it.
Well,
please don't.
You know, people talk about political correctness, and until anybody wants to talk to me about what this country has done to the First Nation people as a general, you know, I don't want to hear nobody do any complaining.
No,
and
horrible.
Oh yeah, you know where I'm coming from. We've discussed this before.
Yep, my heart goes out to all the Native people on the continent for the shitty way they got treated by us.
Well, you know, I asked a friend of mine who is Native. I asked him why. I mean, you're sitting on all this, which not really sitting on it. And let me phrase it the way you have to do it very respectfully, and that, and your respect is returned with an honest reply, and that's what I love about the ingenuous people out there. I asked, how come they don't freely share this with the white man? And he said, well, we tried to when we first, you know, was settling down, but the white man would make fun of us whenever we would bring some of this magnitude up. And so we just learned, well, heck, if you want to remain stupid, I ain't going to tell you nothing else. And then you go looking at the totem poles out in the Pacific Northwest, and every animal on those poles is a very real animal that exists. And you're going to look at those same poles, and you're going to see a Bigfoot on those poles, and you're going to say, okay, let's just jack with people from future generations by saying there's something up here that walks like a man. Yeah. And, you know, you want to laugh at that one, but you're not going to laugh at the killer whale or the eagle or the bear or whatever else is represented on that totem pole. But you're going to say that's been put there just to pull the white man's leg one day. That's bullshit, man. That's bullshit.
No way. No, the other thing is that's really obvious is just go look at all the different languages of all the native tribes across North America, and guess what? They all have a name for Bigfoot.
Yes.
Why would they all make up the same boogeyman? Seriously, come on.
And that's why I have a problem at times when, you know, we call them boogers in the South. Yes.
Yep.
That's what I was learned, you know, not really taught, but that's what they would call these things because they didn't understand what they were. Mm-hmm. I'm Choctaw from the Mississippi Choctaw. Choctaw called these Champé, Shampe. It's kind of like a French word. It's a bastardized French word, but they call them the Champé. But the Choctaw also have other names for it, and then you've got those who call it Sasquatch, you know, the Celeste Indians, and I get to talking about boogers, and people get pissed off at me. Oh, that ain't a booger, that's a Bigfoot. Well, it's really not a Bigfoot either. If we're going to get technical about it, let's make it a Sasquatch. But then if you're going to call it a Sasquatch, how come I can't call it what the Choctaw call it way down here in Mississippi, you know? So actually, it's all of these names.
Yeah.
Are you with me? I mean,
I just generically call them Bigfoot or Biggies.
Well, yeah, why not?
If it's a Sasquatch, a booger, a Yeti, a Yowie, whatever, it's a Bigfoot.
As long as we're still in the neighborhood of the same general creature, I ain't got a problem with what you call it.
Yeah. And just like anything else, there's going to be differences. There's going to be variations in the local populations. The ones down in Florida aren't going to be exactly the same as the ones up in Alaska. But we're still basically talking about the same critter.
Well, the ecosystem is going to give each one's various differences, various changes, you know. Yeah. I can see one in Florida looking like a mop, and I'll tell you why. The long hair would help it with the blood-sucking varmints and actually would make it cooler in the summertime because if it gets wet, they would be able to retain more cool air underneath the hair. Whereas, say, up north, I don't see them being that hairy compared to it down here because of the environment, you know. I just don't see it. But we're all talking basically about the same creature.
Yeah. Well, when you get far enough north, like up into Canada and stuff, they all start having long hair then because it's winter all the time.
I can see. But see, you got those flies up there. And I heard them suckers are like these mosquitoes down south. They're demons, those deer flies.
Yeah, if you get up on the tundra and stuff, they've got the mosquitoes and the deer flies up there, and they got a special kind of mosquitoes that have antifreeze in their blood.
And what did you say about the farther north you get, they're more hairier? See, there's Mother Nature taking care of a booger, you know, due to the environment or the local ecosystem.
Well, the other thing is, too, size. Just like every other kind of animal, the further north they get, for some bizarre reason, they tend to be bigger.
That's
no doubt, too. You get up in Alaska, and the friggin' things are like little mountains walking around.
I'm with you. Look at the Kodiak bear compared to other location.
Exactly. Yeah. You go down the southern U.S., and the bigger bears that you got down there, you know, max 400 or 500 pounds. And even you get up this far north, we're not even to the border yet, and we got 1,000-pounders walking around. You get up there in Alaska, and they're, you know, about 1,500 pounds, almost a ton. My God, huge difference.
Oh, yeah. Well, I really enjoyed being on your show tonight, brother, and I've had a good time doing it. What do you think?
Well, I just hope that we managed to clear up this whole thing and that everybody can look at the LaFlore incident with a little bit different view now.
In 2 years, you've got this now to throw at them as an answer. But you're going to say, here, listen to this third show right here, and maybe that'll drop all these little misgivings you have about the LaFlore massacre.
Yeah. You don't have to worry about poor Captain LaFleur getting his head tore off.
No, he ain't running around headless. He's doing all right.
There's no headless ghost out there haunting the plains in the booger lands.
Enjoyed it as always, Duke. I appreciate you having me on the show, brother.
All right, Bear. Have a great night. And everybody else, thanks for listening to the show. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to be kind to everybody else. Safety first, last, and always. And remember, whatever you do not hug the booger. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Night, guys.